In our efforts to be more inclusive and more equitable in our data work, whether it be through our data collection efforts, when we're analyzing data, or when we're communicating and visualizing our data, to be more equitable in our work, we need to think carefully about the people and communities that we're focusing on. Because if we can think more equitably and more inclusively as we look through data through that lens, we can be more likely that our work, our recommendations, our solutions are going to be implemented or going to be taken into place. The project I'm going to talk about today is just part of a larger do no harm project that my colleague Alice Feng and I began a couple of years ago. This first report, the Do No Harm Guide Applying Equity Awareness in Data Visualization, came out of the racial justice protests just a few years ago. Alice, who is a developer, and myself, who is trained as an economist and spends a lot of time in the data visualization field, we're talking about how we could be a part of this conversation about racial injustice across the United States and, of course, across the world. And as people working in the data visualization field, we didn't see a lot of concentrated efforts on how to view our work through an equity and inclusive lens. So we started to think about how we would like to represent people and communities more inclusively and more equitably in our own work. So the project I'm going to talk about today is a culmination of those efforts, and it was just the beginning part of a longer set of reports that are addressing all sorts of inequities in data visualization, whether it be through data privacy and security, accessibility, or data around gender and sexual orientation. Now, before I get too much into content, let me just do a little bit of level setting. I am a middle-aged, this point far in the pandemic, definitely middle-aged white male, and so I may not be the best person to be talking about these particular issues around equity and inclusivity. But I am a Jewish American. I have had my experience with anti-Semitism. Here in Virginia, we had a gubernatorial race just a couple of years ago and had my own experiences then. But the fact remains that as a white American, my experience in this country is just fundamentally different than many other people across the country and across the world. I, for example, am not particularly worried about what might happen if I walked in my neighborhood at nighttime in a hooded sweatshirt, or what might happen if I'm pulled over by the police. So that experience is just fundamentally different. But that being said, as someone who spent a lot of time working in government, working in public policy, and doing public policy research, and also as just a member of society and as a dad to two kids, these are the issues that we really need to start thinking about more carefully and more strategically, so that when we create our visualizations, or when we produce our reports, or our policy recommendations, or our policy solutions, our work is more likely to be utilized, recommended, and put into place. So I'm going to talk about the depths of this report in just a couple of seconds, but what I want to start with is just letting you know what we didn't do. What we didn't do in this report is talk about visualizations that are explicitly racist. And there are, unfortunately, lots of examples of visualizations that are explicitly racist. This is just one example. This is called a redlining map. You may have heard that term before. I want to explain what you see in this redlining map of Chicago. Redlining maps were created by a federal government agency in the 1930s and 1940s known as the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC. And the HOLC created these redlining maps for all major metropolitan areas around the country. And what they did is they went into these different cities and they evaluated and assessed the mortgage risk for each of the different neighborhoods in these major metropolitan cities. And of course, that would lead to whether banks would lend to different people at different rates. So what you see in front of you is what's called a redlining map. This is for Chicago. The green and blue areas of the city were deemed low mortgage risk, so high value. And the red areas are those that are determined to be low value or high mortgage risk. And a red neighborhood earned that color if there was a single black or African American person living in that neighborhood. It didn't matter if the neighborhood had high quality housing stock. It didn't matter if everybody was employed. It didn't matter what the median income was. The only thing that mattered was that a single black or African American person was living in that neighborhood, and therefore it earned a red color. And of course, these maps have had a long and enduring impact on the wealth accumulation and segregation in America's cities. So when people look at this map, they may not immediately see the racist overtones of this map. What I want to show you is a description the HOLC wrote about this map. And as you can see here, the HOLC wrote in 1940 about this redlining map of Chicago. The neighborhood is graded D because of its concentration of Negroes, but the section may improve to a third-class area as this element is forced out. Now, I think when we read this sentence, we see it as explicitly racist, but we don't necessarily see the visualization in the same light. But I also want to show you how these maps have had a long and enduring impact on the wealth accumulation and segregation in America's cities. This is a story from February of 2022 from 538 that showed that segregation in Chicago today mirrors segregation about 100 years ago in those redlined areas. In March 2022, the Washington Post did a story on air quality in redlined neighborhoods in those cities. And as you can see here at the bottom histogram, the air quality in redlined neighborhoods is markedly worse than in other areas in these cities today, based on those maps created in the 1930s and 1940s. The New York Times in August of 2020 did a story about Richmond, Virginia, and showed that tree cover was less than in redlined areas. Paved surfaces, there was more paved surfaces in redlined areas, and by extension, there was a higher temperature gradient in redlined areas than in non-redlined areas in Richmond, Virginia. And if you want an even broader view, NPR did a similar story and found that redlined areas in these major metropolitan areas had a higher temperature gradient than non-redlined areas. So as you can see, these redlined maps have had a long and enduring impact on not just wealth inequality, in particular wealth inequality, intra-generational wealth inequality, but also intergenerational inequality, because Americans tend to pass our wealth through our homes from one generation to the next. But it has also had a huge and profound impact on segregation and on temperature and the environment. So what did we do in this particular report? Well, we spoke to more than 24 people across a variety of sectors, from sociology to economics to data journalism to public health, and asked them to tell us how they tried to take an equitable, inclusive approach to their data work. And I think this quote from Kim Bui, one of the data journalists we spoke with, really sums up this thread that comes through the entire report, which is, if I were one of the data points on this visualization, would I feel offended? This concept of empathy is the thing that is the common thread through all of our interviews. That if we as people working with data can take that empathetic view, if we can turn our perspective around and think about how we would like to be represented in the data, be it in the survey itself or be it in the final visualization that is summarizing the data, if I felt like I was being offended through the way those data are being used and depicted, is that an equitable, inclusive approach to data work? So I want to talk about some of the most practical pieces in this particular report. We talk about lots of different aspects of the data ecosystem, from funders to organizations and agencies that do the surveys, but I'm going to focus on the ones that are most practical, so that when you're done watching this video, you can go back to your data work today and start trying to implement some of these, I'll call them loosely guidelines, but really just things for you to think about as you're working with your data. So I'm going to start with language, because I think language is one of the ways that many of us think about trying to take a more equitable and more inclusive approach to our work, because we have seen changes in language over time. And the challenge, of course, with language is that it's always nuanced and it's evolving and it's changing over time. Words or phrases that we use today may not be words or phrases that we used yesterday. It may not be words or phrases that we use tomorrow. And we've seen more recently an evolution in the words that we use to describe people and communities. For example, we now tend to use people-first language rather than identity-first language. So instead of saying disabled people, we might say people with disabilities. But even that practice is not necessarily uniform across all communities and all identities and all groups. For example, this is the first part of an infographic from a group that works on behalf of people with autism. And they did a survey of their organization's members, and they found that more than 80% of their members preferred identity-first language rather to person-first language. So their members preferred autistic person rather than the phrase person with autism. So this is a challenge that we have to face when we're working with our data, is that even if we think there are rules and guidelines and common practices, they may not apply to every community, every group, every locality. Let's take another one that is fairly common, which is the evolution of the words Hispanic and Latino. The United States in particular started moving towards the words Hispanic and Latino in the 1960s and the 1970s. Prior to that, people were really called by their country of origin, so Puerto Rican Americans, Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans. But because of a variety of different trends in the 60s and 70s, The Census Bureau in particular landed on the terms Hispanic and Latino to describe this particular ethnic group. But more recently, we've seen an evolution towards the word Latinx. And the point of the word Latinx is to try to get around the gender binary suffix of the word Latino and Latina. But many people say that it's hard to pronounce in both Spanish and in English. And the question, of course, is, do people to which this word is trying to describe, does that group prefer that word? And yet we've seen growth in the use of this word over the last 10 or so years. And only recently we actually have data to help us better understand whether the Hispanic and Latino population actually wants this word to be used to describe themselves. So let's take a look at some of the data. In August of 2020, the Pew Research Center did a survey of people who identified as Hispanic and Latino and found that 2/3 of folks that they interviewed, again, who identified as Hispanic and Latino, 2/3 that said the word Latinx should not be used to describe their particular group. About a year later, Gallup did a similar survey. They, again, interviewed people who identified as Hispanic and Latino, found that 23% of their survey respondents preferred the word Hispanic, 15% said Latino, only 4% said Latinx, 57% said it does not matter, and then Gallup did a follow-up question and said, oh, okay, but if you had to choose, which term would you choose? Again, 57% said Hispanic, 37% Latino, and only 5% said that they prefer the word Latinx. In December of 2021, a Democratic polling firm did a survey again of Hispanic and Latino, people who identified as Hispanic and Latino, found that only 2% said that they prefer the word Latinx, and about 40% said that the word Latinx would bother or offend them at least a little bit. So there's really limited support for the word Latinx amongst the group for whom that word is supposed to describe. Now, we've seen an evolution towards this word Latinx, and even more recently, we've seen an evolution towards the word Latina, which again is trying to get around the binary gender suffix of the word Latino, Latina, but maybe a little bit easier to say. But again, we'll have to see what the data say to see whether the Hispanic and Latino population actually likes that word and starts to use that word. And of course, again, aggregate data may mask some of the regional or local preferences for certain words, which again is why it's so important for those of us working with data to talk to people and to talk to communities so that we can better understand their preferences and their desires for how they're represented in the data. Okay, so that's language, but let's take language and let's apply it to data visualization. What you see here is what's called a bivariate choropleth map. This is the top third of a Tableau visualization. I'm going to zoom in here in just a second so you can see more of the data. But just in case you don't know, let me describe or define what a bivariate choropleth map is. This is a choropleth map. You've probably seen many of these before. This choropleth map is showing the unemployment rate in states across the United States. This is using a blue sequential color palette. So we have light blue colors corresponding to low unemployment rates and dark blue colors corresponding to high unemployment rates. So you've probably seen maps like this before. Well, the bivariate choropleth map, which is what you see here, is actually very similar, but instead of showing one variable, it's actually going to show two variables. So let me zoom in to show you what those two variables are. So here we have two variables. Along the vertical dimension is labeled more poverty, and along the horizontal dimension is the label more black, and that is the density of Black or African American residents in each county. So we can look at these two variables on the map. So counties that have a higher density of Black or African American residents and have a lower concentration or density of Black or African American residents and a lower poverty rate are in that yellow or orangish color in the bottom left, which you can see in kind of the upper Midwest part of the thumbnail map in the top of the slide. And counties that have a higher density of Black or African American residents and a higher poverty rate are in that very, very dark purple color, that almost black color, which you can see in the southeastern part of the United States. So now you know how to read a bivariate choropleth map. Let's take a look at the words that are used in this legend. Along the vertical dimension, we have the phrase more poverty. Well, poverty is an experience. It's not a static description of a person or a household. My household income can place me below the poverty line this year, but not necessarily next year. Now, more importantly, for this particular body of work, is the phrase more black. Now, black references skin color, doesn't reference people. So one thing we want to think about to take this equitable and inclusive lens to our data work is to reference people, not skin color. And again, we can go back to Kim's comment from earlier. Would I feel offended if I was represented in this way? For me personally, if I saw the phrase more Jewish, that is not a phrase that I would like to see describing me as a person, my identity. So what can we do instead to use language that is more equitable and more inclusive? Maybe we use phrases like larger proportion of people in poverty or larger proportion of the black population. Both are more verbose, both are longer, neither really kind of fit as nicely on the legend or maybe in the bar chart or on the table. But again, if we want people to see themselves in the data, which we know is important and we know will help them embrace the work, then we want them to see themselves in the data and not be offended by the way that we're actually showing that information. I'll also say that just because we've used words in the past or phrases in the past doesn't mean we need to continue using those particular words. This is a map from the Twitter feed Indian Pixels. Just want to zoom in very quickly on the legend here. I mean, I just love the word wise men for people who are 90 and older. Just a great way to think about using a more active, positive, affirming title rather than maybe some of the other words that we've come to know to define this particular group. Similarly, this is the picture of the ticket window at a botanical gardens near my house here in Northern Virginia. I just love the phrase super adults to describe those who are 55 and older. Again, just because we've used words in the past doesn't mean we need to use them going forward. We can think more positive, more affirming, so that when people do see themselves in the data, do see themselves in the ticket window, for example, they are not offended and they have that more positive affirmation. Let's turn our attention to ordering labels in a purposeful way. Now, I'm trained as an economist, and what you're going to see here is 4 random tables from 4 random economics journals. And what you might notice in these 4 tables is that the data, the results around race are always ordered the same way. They're always ordered white, black, American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and other. And the question is why? Why do we always place white in the first position as if it's the top, it's the norm, it's the default? Well, for me, it's actually not surprising because of the major federal surveys and data sets that most economists use. They're going to reinforce this basic hierarchy of placing the white group at the top, at the norm as the default. What you see here is the question on race from the decennial census. So question 9 says, what is person 1's race? There's a box that you can check for white, and then there's a whole area there, a row where you can write in more details. You'll notice next to white, it says, there's a little prompt that says print, for example, German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian, etc. After the 2020 census results came out, there was a little bit of pushback from people who are from the Middle East and Northern Africa who said, well, I don't identify as white. Why is the Census Bureau trying to push me into that particular group? But for purposes of this presentation, notice that we have white in the first position, black or African American people in the second spot, little checkbox. Then we have American Indian or Alaskan Natives in the third area. And then we continue below. We have boxes for Chinese, Vietnamese, Native Hawaiians, and so on. And then at the bottom, we have some other race. Let's take a look at a couple of the major federal surveys that economists and social scientists often use. This is from the Current Population Survey. There are 6 options here. Again, white at the top coded as 1, black or African American coded as 2, all the way down to 6 for the other group. And it's important here to note that those numbers are meaningful because when you go get the data, when you go grab the Current Population Survey, the data are coded in that way. So people who identify as white are coded as 1. Black or African American people coded as 2. So you could take those data and you could calculate a mean. It wouldn't mean anything. It's just a number. But you could calculate that number. So what that means is I'm not surprised when I see data and results ordered in the way that you see it on the screen here. Because if I just take those data out and I sort them, I get in this order representing the structures and the institutions and the surveys that we've been conducting in the United States for decades. But let's take a look at a couple of others. Survey of income and program participation. You can see we have 7 options here. Again, white is 1, black is 2. Survey of consumer finances from the Federal Reserve Board. We have 8 different options here. Again, white is 1, black is 2, 3 Hispanic, Latino. Panel study of income dynamics from the University of Michigan. Again, 1 is white, 2 is black. And then from the consumer expenditure survey, we have 9 options. 1 is white, 2 is black, all the way down to 9 for the other category. So again, when I see tables like this, I'm not surprised that the order of the results matches or mimics the order of the options in the survey, because that's how they're coded and that's how they're provided. So for those of us who are working with data, the question is, how can we take a more purposeful approach to ordering our results? Well, I'm going to give you a second just to take a look at this table from the Brookings Institution. Here they have the number of PhD economists in each Federal Reserve bank. The banks are ordered along the first column along the rows, and the racial groups along the columns in the first row. I'm going to give you a moment just to take a look at the ordering along both those dimensions. Notice here, and I think it becomes fairly clear fairly quickly, that when you look down the first column, you can see that they're ordered alphabetically. But along the columns, the racial groups, they're not ordered in any particular logical way. They're not ordered by number, they're not ordered alphabetically, and yet the white group is in that first position in the first most left column. Now, if you go to CVS and try to order your COVID test, you get to the question on race, and the drop-down menu here actually has the other, patient refused, and unknown categories right in the middle of the drop-down menu, because these options are ordered alphabetically. So it may feel odd to see the other group kind of in the middle of this drop-down menu, but by creating and using an alphabetical ordering, we don't have to make any decisions and any arbitrary decisions about which group we should place in that first, second, those hierarchy positions. So what can you do? Well, first off, think about whether there is a better way, or a more inclusive, a more equitable way, to present your results, to order your results, than just the way that they show up in the underlying data. So ask yourself some questions. Does your study focus on a particular community? And if it does, perhaps that group should be presented first. If you are, say, doing a dashboard or an analysis or study on the inequality in, let's say, wealth among Black or African American headed households, perhaps the results for that group should come first, rather than just mimicking what the data are in the current population survey or in the census. Secondly, is there a particular argument or story that you're trying to tell? And if so, the order of your results should match the story that you're trying to tell. Have those two things work together. Have your text, and your tables and your graphs match, and have those stories reinforce one another. And finally, perhaps there's a quantitative relationship that you can use that can help guide your decision about how to order these particular groups. Maybe they can be sorted alphabetically, or maybe they can be ordered by sample size, either weighted or unweighted. Or maybe you could sort them by population size, in which case, if you were using nationally representative data, you would have the white group in the first position. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong. It's not objectively wrong to have the white group in the first position. But at least by thinking through your different options, you can say, we've made a conscious decision about how we want to order these data, and they match the point of the analysis and the story that we're trying to tell and the recommendations that we're trying to make. So we've talked about language and we've talked about ordering our results. Let's talk about missing groups. And I'm going to distinguish here between missing data and missing groups. So missing data might be, you have your survey results and maybe someone didn't answer the question about income or age or number of people in the family, whatever it is. And there are ways and mechanisms and strategies that you can use to fill in those missing data. Here I'm talking about missing groups. So groups that are actually not even represented in the survey itself. And I think one of the easiest ways to think about this is gender. We know that gender is not binary, and yet every survey I just showed you, every survey, the questions about gender are male and female. And furthermore, the options are always ordered. Male is the first position, coded as number 1. Female in the second position, coded as number 2. And you'll notice here that this does not correspond to the size of the population. There are more females in the United States than males. And it's not alphabetical. So here again, just like placing that white group in the first position, we are creating a default, a hierarchy, a norm that the white group, the white identity, or the male identity is in that first position. Now I will say there are bad ways to ask questions about gender that are not necessarily binary. Here are just a few examples. You can see here we have a drop-down menu on the top left that the options are female, male, NA, unknown, and tax entity. I actually think my favorite of these four drop-down menus is the one at the top right. I identify as male, and I would not know how to answer the question if the options were male, female, and human. So these are ways not to ask these questions. So let's turn to race though, because that's the point of this particular report. What I'm going to show you here are my estimates of the poverty rates for those 6 major racial groups we've been talking about. So this is from the 2019 American Community Survey. You can see we have a fairly steep gradient of poverty rates from 9.7% for the Asian or Pacific Islander group, all the way up to 23% for the American Indian or Alaskan Native group. Now here again, keep in mind that these 6 estimates are masking a lot of variation underlying the data, because remember, in the American Community Survey, people can select the box for their aggregate group, but then write in more details in those boxes below. So let's take a look at what the poverty rates are when we look at those more detailed responses. And you see here, we get a much larger variation in data. Let's take a look at the American Indian or Alaskan Native group at the very top. You can see that the 23.1% overall poverty rate masks huge variation in the data, from around 5% at the far left to nearly 40% on the far right. Now, this isn't to say that we can or should necessarily show all these individual detailed groups all the time, because the sample size of these different groups varies considerably. Some of these groups just have hundreds of responses. Some of them have tens of thousands of responses. So from the stance of being able to make statistically reasonable comparisons, we do need to keep that in mind. But we can also keep in mind that simply by showing a single point estimate, we are masking a lot of variation, and we are not showing the identities and the experiences of lots of other groups across the United States or across the world. Let's also take a look at the word other. Other's a really interesting part of the idea of taking a more equitable and inclusive lens to our data work. Here's the definition of the word other in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. I just thought I'd go in and take a look at how the word is actually defined. And for me, what was really interesting is this 5th entry at the bottom: disturbingly or threateningly different. That there's some connotation around the word other, that this group is somehow disturbance or somehow a threat. And that's the thing that we really need to think carefully about as we're using this word other, because there's no better way to other a person or other a community than by literally calling them other. So what are some alternatives we could use? Well, some folks we spoke to suggested the word and other. Now, the grammar doesn't quite match up, but I think we could sort of all get over that. But we also think there are some additional alternatives that we could consider. So here are some alternatives that we propose. Again, these are not rules, these are not guidelines. These are just things to consider, to put into the hopper as you're working with your data. Another race or races, additional groups, all other self-descriptions, people identifying as other or multiple races, identity not listed, and identity not listed in the survey. So you may come to your data and you do have that option for other, and you might want to choose to say, use the phrase identity not listed. Now, if you're like me, who has gone through my career as a quantitative economist, you might be a little bit worried, as I am, about changing that word other. Because it is true that the person in the survey did check the box for that word. And so is it okay for me to change the word in the chart or the text or the results to say identity not listed? And where I've come down personally is to say, I am going to make that change because I don't want to other people and communities. I'm going to use one of these alternative phrases, but I'm going to make a note in the report, in the table, in the dashboard to say the American Community Survey uses the word other. I've chosen for purposes of this particular work to use the phrase identity not listed or identity not listed in the survey. Now, whether you agree or disagree with some of these alternative phrases, I think we can all agree that the phrase something else is not one that we would want to use to describe people. Again, we have to remember that there are people behind the data. And if we want to take this more inclusive lens, we need to think about those people's experiences as they answer the questions and as they see themselves in the data. Let's turn our attention to colors, because colors are such an important part of the data visualization toolkit. Again, I'm going to show you an example so that you can see how this is utilized in practice. This is a Tableau dashboard from MIT. It's called their Student Diversity Dashboard. I'm going to zoom in just a second so you can see what the actual groups are. There are 2 large panels in this dashboard. The line chart on the left is showing changes in the racial makeup of the student body over time. And the stacked chart on the right is showing the distribution of these different groups in these 6 or so different colleges or departments in the university. Let's dive in and take a look at the legend. We have 9 different groups here. Black or African American students in the top left column in that dark red color, all the way down to Asian students in the lighter red color in the bottom left. And in the second column on the right, we have students who identify as 2 or more races in the lightest red color, white students in the blue color, and then we have 2 groups in shades of gray, international students and students who did not provide their race. There are at least 2 problems with this particular color palette. The first one is the obvious one, that the white students are the only student group that gets their own color, which implies that this is somehow the group to which all of these other groups should be compared with, that they are somehow the norm, they are the default, they are the group that we should be aspiring towards. The other problem's a little more subtle. We need to go back to our choropleth map from earlier. Remember our sequential color palette that we were using in this choropleth map? The light blue colors correspond to the low unemployment rates, and the dark blue colors correspond to the high unemployment rates. Well, that sequential color palette is being used here. So the implicit suggestion here is that somehow Black or African American students are somehow more than or greater than students who identify as Asian or as 2 or more races. And so after some gentle pushback for Twitter, MIT changed the dashboard. They used some different colors. And so we can dive in and take a look at this color palette. And you can see it's slightly different. You see here that we do have shades of blue and green for Black or African American students. White students are now in this peachish color, international students in red. Now, I'm not saying it's inherently easy to select or create a legend of 9 distinct colors. If you went to Color Brewer and selected 9 separate colors right now for a categorical color palette, you could do that, but you'll still see, as you can see here, you're going to get shades of greens and blues and oranges. So it's not easy to do. But this leads to our last section, which is, should we be using a single graph or should we be using small multiples? Breaking up our data into small multiple charts or even across separate pages. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach here. This is a graph of the poverty rate from 2008 to 2019 for 5 of our major racial groups that we've been talking about. You can see that in this particular graph, the white group in the blue line is the bottom, the lowest poverty rates. But what happens in graphs like this when we put all of our racial groups on the same graph is we sort of create a horse race effect, where it's sort of implied that all these lines should be striving to achieve the best outcome, which is, in this case, the group with the lowest poverty rate. But the goal is really not to have the poverty rates driven down to the group that has the lowest poverty rate. The goal is to drive the poverty rate down as far as physically possible. So we create graphs like this, when we put all of our groups on the same graph, on the same slide, we end up creating this horse race effect where we're trying to implicitly achieve whatever the best performing group is. So one possible alternative to that is to just use a small multiples approach. Here I've broken out those 5 racial groups into 5 separate graphs, each shown in the blue line, and then the dashed yellow line is showing the national average. So again, we're trying to move away from that horse race effect where we're comparing to one particular group. And another way to think about this is to move away from abstract shapes like bars and lines. So for example, here I have the poverty rate in all 50 states in 2021 for each of these 5 large groups. Instead of just showing the overall average or just showing a bar chart of the overall average, that abstract shape, here we can help show people the variation. We can help show our readers that there's more variation and more detail in the data than in just a single point estimate. And we kind of get the similar sort of thing when we get to a box and whisker plot. We're actually showing more of the variation. Now, I think there is a case, however, where it does make sense to place all of the groups on a single graph. What you see here is a graph of showing deaths by suicide rates for youths 12 to 17 across 5 different racial groups from 2001 to 2019. And here you can see that the suicide rates for Native American youths is much higher and is growing much faster than for other groups. And in this case, I think we may want to actually keep these data on the same graph, because in this case, we're actually trying to highlight the disparities. So there's a little bit of a nuance here, and it's something that I think we need to, as a field, explore and understand. But I think what we want to try to do is when we're trying to highlight disparities and to show that the rate for one particular group is so much higher than another group, is we do want to put them on the same graph. But when we're trying to show and compare different racial groups, generally, we may not want to put them on the same graph because we end up creating this sort of horse race effect where we're trying to push people to see that the best performance, the outcome, the desired outcome is whatever racial or ethnic group has the best performance or the best outcomes in that particular measure. So I want to remind you as I close up here that the data that we use are a reflection of the lives of real people. There are people that sit behind the American Community Survey, the Census Bureau, all the data that we use all the time. And if we want to think more equitably and more inclusively about how people will see themselves in the data and how those data will be used in our policy recommendations or our solutions, we need to keep in mind how people will see themselves. And I think if you could take just some of the strategies here, not that they're rules and not that they're guidelines, but to think carefully about how you're representing these different groups, I think your work will go farther and be more likely to be used and implemented. I'm going to remind you just one more time that this particular research report, this first project on racial equity, is part of a larger project on doing less harm with our data and our data visualizations. We have many other reports on this project site, and it's been growing over time to address issues around accessibility, around data privacy and data security, and around data around gender and sexual orientation. I hope you'll consider taking a look at more of these reports so that you can take a more equitable and inclusive lens to all of your data work so that your work can be more impactful.